The afternoon sun of Redemption, New Mexico, baked the hope right out of the air. Inside the First Territorial Bank, however, the air was cool, smelling of oiled wood and the quiet ambition of paper currency. Coulter Vane held his wife's hand, her fingers laced through his, a warm, familiar pressure against his palm. May's smile was the brightest thing in the dim room, brighter than the polished brass teller cage, brighter than the future they were about to secure. Just a few more signatures, Mr. Vane said. The bank manager, a portly man named Abernathy, whose spectacles perpetually slid down his nose. He pushed a land deed and a loan agreement across the vast expanse of his mahogany desk. With this, you'll have the capital to buy the Miller parcel. Your ranch will be the biggest in the county. Our ranch, May corrected gently, her green eyes sparkling. She squeezed Coulter's hand. We've been dreaming of this since we first staked our claim. Coulter just nodded, his heart too full for words. He picked up the pen, its nib scratching against the paper, a sound of permanence, of a life being built, ink on a page. He signed his name, the loops and slants, a testament to years of hard labor finally paying off. He could already see it, the new corrals, the expanded herd, a small room added to the house for the child they prayed for every night. He had just handed the pen to May when the world shattered. The bank's double doors flew open with a percussive blast that rattled the windows. 4 men, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, stormed in. They moved with a brutal efficiency, a cloud of dust and menace. The tallest one, his voice a gravelly roar, brandished a Colt peacemaker. Nobody move. This is a robbery. Panic erupted. A woman screamed. Abernathy fumbled under his desk. Coulter's first instinct was to shield May, pulling her behind him as he stood his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Stay down, he whispered, his body a wall between her and the chaos. The outlaws were a whirlwind of violent motion. One vaulted over the teller cage, stuffing fistfuls of money into a burlap sack. Another kept his pistol trained on the terrified customers cowering on the floor. A third, younger and wirier than the others, seemed consumed by a nervous energy. His eyes darted everywhere, his knuckles white on the grip of his revolver. He was a lit fuse in a powder keg. "Hurry it up, Jesse," the leader barked at the nervous one. The young outlaw, Jesse, flinched at the sound of his name. He swung his gun toward the manager's office, where Abernathy was trying to slide a shotgun from its hiding place. "Don't even think about it, old man." Jesse shrieked, his voice cracking with fear. Coulter saw the tremor in the boy's hand, the wildness in his eyes. He saw the hammer of the Colt pull back. Time seemed to slow, stretching into an unbearable silence between heartbeats. He saw the flash before he heard the sound. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, a concussive boom that seemed to suck the air from the room. It was not a deliberate shot, but a convulsion of pure terror. The bullet didn't strike Abernathy. It tore through the thin wall of the office, splintering wood, and screamed across the lobby. Coulter felt a sharp, staggering blow against his back, as if he'd been struck by a hammer. But it wasn't him. It was the sudden dead weight of May collapsing against him. A small, confused sound escaped her lips, a soft sigh. "Coulter," she whispered. He turned, catching her as her legs gave way. He lowered her gently to the floor, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. A dark crimson stain was blossoming on the front of her simple cotton dress just below her heart. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a placid surprise. The outlaws, their robbery complete, were already scrambling for the door. "Let's go, now," the leader yelled. Jesse, the young shooter, stared at May, his face a mask of horror behind his bandana. His gun hand trembled uncontrollably. As he turned to flee, something silver slipped from his vest pocket, clattering unheard onto the polished floorboards. He didn't notice. He just ran. The world had narrowed for Coulter. There was no bank, no money, no outlaws. There was only May's face, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He pressed his hand against the wound, a useless, desperate gesture. "Stay with me, May." He pleaded, his voice a choked whisper. "Abernathy, get the doctor. Somebody help." But he knew. He saw it in her eyes as the light began to fade, the vibrant green turning dull and distant. She lifted a hand, her fingers brushing his cheek. "Our ranch," she murmured, her voice barely audible. A faint smile touched her lips, a ghost of the one she'd worn just moments before. And then she was still. The life he had so carefully built, the future signed in, ink bled out onto the floor of the First Territorial Bank. He held her, rocking her gently in his arms, oblivious to the sirens of sorrow wailing in his own soul. Long after the sheriff arrived, long after the other customers had been ushered away, he remained there, a statue of grief. It was only when they finally convinced him to let her go that his gaze fell upon the object lying near the office door. A silver locket, tarnished and dented, lay gleaming against the dark wood. He knelt, his knees cracking, and picked it up. The metal was cold, heavy. On its surface, an artist's hand had etched the image of a lone hawk, its wings spread wide in silent, solitary flight. He closed his fist around it, the sharp edges digging into his palm. This was all that was left. Not a memory, but a promise. A vow of vengeance forged in the instant his world had ended. The cold metal became the anchor for his soul, a symbol of the man he would have to become to find the one who had taken everything. 5 years later, a merciless sun hammered the New Mexico plains, branding the cracked earth with a heat that promised no relief. The wind, when it came, did not cool. It only stirred the red dust, tasting of baked stone and long-dead things. On the edge of this unforgiving expanse, Coulter Vane's ranch house stood as a monument to stubbornness. Its wood was silvered and weathered, its porch listing like a ship weary of its voyage. It was a reflection of the man who lived within it, worn down, silent, but not yet broken. Coulter stood on that porch, arms folded, his gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon. The lines on his face, once etched by sun and laughter, were now carved deep by sorrow. At 35, he felt ancient. The ranch was quiet, not peaceful but empty. The silence was a physical presence, a constant companion that echoed with the ghosts of unspoken words and absent footsteps. May had braided her hair on this very porch, her humming a gentle counterpoint to the morning bird's song. Now the only sound was the mournful cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high in the bleached blue sky. Pinned to a post by the front gate, a single sheet of paper flapped in the hot breeze. The writing was his own, stark, plain, and stripped of all embellishment. Hiring. Ranch cook. Meals for one. Room provided. Must be moral competent and able to stay on property. He'd posted it at noon, an act of sheer necessity. The ranch was failing not for lack of will, but for lack of time. Mending fences, tending the herd, and fighting back the relentless desert left no hours for the simple act of staying alive. He was bone-weary, and his grief had long since burned away any pretense of self-sufficiency. By 1 o'clock he had nearly forgotten the notice, until the slow crunch of footsteps on the gravel drive pulled his attention from the distant hills. He looked up, his body tensing. A woman stood at the gate. Her dress was sun-faded to the color of a pale sky, but was impeccably clean. Her boots were coated in a thick layer of travel dust. Dark auburn hair, pinned loosely under a practical bonnet, had strands escaping to frame a face that was tired but resolute. She was not alone. In one arm she held a small child, a boy, with a thumb tucked firmly in his mouth, who clung to her shoulder with the tenacity of a burr. Her other hand guided a slightly older boy, perhaps 6, whose knuckles were white, where he gripped the thin strap of the family's only suitcase. Trailing behind them, a girl no older than 10 dragged a flour sack that looked as if it had survived fire flood and the general wear of a hard-lived life. Coulter descended the steps, his boot heels hitting the dry, packed earth with a dull thud. He stopped a few feet from them, his shadow falling over the small group. The woman did not flinch or offer a weary smile. Her eyes, the green of a coming prairie storm, met his directly. There was no fear in them, only a challenge born of desperation. "You posted for a ranch cook," she said. Her voice was steady, quiet, but precise, carrying a gentle formality that seemed out of place in the harsh landscape. Coulter gave a single curt nod. "I'm a cook," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "Also a mother. And I've got no place else to go." She said it without shame, a simple statement of fact. Coulter's eyes moved from her to the children. 3 pairs of eyes, sunken but fiercely alert, stared up at him. He saw their hunger, their exhaustion, and a profound, watchful quiet that spoke of too many miles and too few kindnesses. He said nothing for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. He thought of the emptiness of the house, the cold hearth, the meals he choked down without tasting. Finally, he stepped aside, his voice low and raspy from disuse. "Come inside. We'll talk over coffee." The woman nodded, once a flicker of relief in her eyes that she quickly masked. It was gratitude, not subservience. She walked past him, herding her children toward the house without asking his name. And he, for the first time in 5 long years, closed the door behind someone other than himself. Coulter Vane was a man of few words and fewer guests. He gave Willa Hartley 3 days. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a silent proclamation. 3 days to prove she could handle the work and, more importantly, respect the suffocating quiet he had cultivated around himself. She did not disappoint. By sundown on the first day, the kitchen, a room that had long smelled of dust and bachelor's neglect, was filled with the aromas of fresh bread beans, simmering with smoked pork and cornbread, so light it crumbled at the touch. She moved through the space with an economy of motion, a quiet rhythm born of long practice. She didn't ask where anything was. She found it. The old wood-burning stove, a cantankerous beast that Coulter fought with daily, yielded to her touch as if tamed. The children were specters of quiet efficiency. The oldest, a girl named Lark, swept the floorboards with a solemn care that went beyond mere chore. The middle child, Silas, a boy with his mother's serious eyes, helped Coulter carry water from the well, his small hands struggling but never failing to keep his grip on the bucket. The youngest, Boone, hardly made a sound, observing the new world from the safety of his mother's hip or a blanket on the floor. They obeyed Willa with a watchfulness that spoke of hard lessons learned on long roads. That night, over a supper that was the first real meal he'd had in years, Coulter finally spoke. "Name's Coulter Vane." "Willa Hartley," she replied, her voice as low and firm as before. He chewed on a piece of cornbread, mulling his next words. "Your husband." A pause stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. Past 3 years now, she finally answered, her eyes on her plate. "Shot in a border raid near El Paso. Wrong place, wrong flag." Coulter didn't ask for more. He understood too well how little bullets cared for timing or names. The next morning, he rode into Redemption for supplies. The general store was a hive of dust motes and buzzing voices, and it didn't take long for the news to find purchase. "Here Coulter's got a woman and 3 young'uns up at his place." A rancher whispered to another over a barrel of oats, his voice laced with insinuation. "She's no kin," the other replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the spittoon. "Saw her myself. No ring and no shame, apparently." Coulter ignored them. He was used to being the subject of morbid speculation, the town's resident ghost. but hearing Willa's name tangled in it stirred something cold and protective in his gut. Later that week, the whispers found their voice. Willa had taken Lark into town for cloth and thread, paying for her meager purchases with coins carefully wrapped in a piece of fabric. As she stepped back onto the boardwalk, a man named Jedediah Thorne leaned against a saloon post, chewing on a matchstick. He was the foreman for the big land baron, who was squeezing smaller outfits in the territory, a man whose confidence was built on the power of others. His vest was unbuttoned over a stained shirt, and his eyes were slow and predatory. "A lady like you don't belong out here alone," he muttered, his gaze lingering on Willa. "Shouldn't be raising kids around a man like Vane. Folks ain't forgot what he is." Willa's posture stiffened, but she simply stepped around him, her face a blank mask. Jedediah reached out his hand, closing around her arm. "I said—" The man's words died in his throat. Coulter had appeared without a sound, his shadow falling over them both. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He simply looked at Jedediah, his eyes flat and cold as river stones, then let his hand drift slowly, deliberately, to rest on the worn leather of his gun belt. Buying thread, Coulter said, his voice a low rumble. "You looking to stop that?" Jedediah's bravado shrank like a puddle in the noon sun. He yanked his hand back, as if burned, raising both palms in a gesture of surrender. "Didn't mean nothing, Vane. Just talking." Coulter didn't blink, then talk less. He turned and waited for Willa, who stood still beside him, her expression unreadable. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. They walked back to the wagon in a shared, charged silence. That night, as Coulter lit his lantern on the porch, he glanced toward the small bunkhouse where he'd put the family. Willa stood near the kitchen stove, mending a torn hem by the fading firelight. He realized he still didn't know the full story of why she constantly looked over her shoulder or what ghosts chased her across the territory. But for now, she cooked his meals, kept his house, and asked for nothing in return. And for the first time in 5 years, the ranch felt less like a tomb and more like a place that was still breathing. The storm rolled in from the west, without warning, a bruised purple curtain that swallowed the setting sun. The sky went from gold to hammered steel in minutes, and the first crack of thunder split the evening air, a sound like the world cracking at its seams. Coulter was finishing a final fence check, the wind already whipping at his hat, kicking up dust in thick, stinging gusts. He urged his horse toward the barn, just as the rain began, not as a drizzle, but as a sudden, violent deluge. The drops were heavy cold, pelting the dry earth and turning it instantly to slick red mud. By the time he reached the porch, Willa was already there, holding the door open, her face etched with concern. "It's a mean one," she said, her voice nearly lost in the wind's howl. "Like something's trying to rip the sky in half." "It might," Coulter replied, swinging down from his saddle. He handed her the reins. "I need to check the livestock. The sorrel panics if the wind hits from the west." He didn't wait for an argument, just grabbed his coat from a peg and plunged back into the maelstrom, heading for the barn. The lightning was almost constant now, illuminating the landscape in stark, jagged flashes. Inside the barn, the horses were already frantic, their eyes wide with terror, nostrils flaring as they kicked against their stalls. He stepped inside just as the wind slammed the heavy wooden doors shut behind him with a deafening boom. A tremendous crack echoed from above. The old roof beams, the ones he'd meant to replace for the past 2 seasons, groaned under the strain like dying animals. And then he heard it. A small, terrified cry. "Silas!" he yelled, his voice sharp with alarm. Another flash of lightning lit up the far corner of the barn. There, huddled behind a half-collapsed hay trough, was the boy. He was soaked through, shaking uncontrollably, his tiny hands clamped over his head, as if he could block out the storm's fury. Coulter's chest seized. He plunged forward, dodging the panicked lunges of a spooked mare shoving through falling hay and loose boards. The ceiling above them let out a high, screaming shriek as wood splintered. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward, throwing his body over the boy, just as a massive support beam tore loose from the rafters. The impact was a blinding explosion of pain. The heavy timber slammed against Coulter's shoulder, pinning him to the ground. He felt a sickening snap in his collarbone, a deep, shearing agony that burned like a white-hot brand. But he kept his arms locked around Silas, shielding the boy's small frame with his own. "You all right, son?" he gasped through gritted teeth. The boy was sobbing, but he nodded against Coulter's chest. Coulter grunted, using his good arm and his legs to shove against the immense weight of the beam. It wouldn't budge. He tried again, a raw groan tearing from his throat, every muscle screaming in protest. On the third try, summoning a strength born of pure desperation, the beam shifted just enough for him to drag himself and Silas free. By the time he staggered out of the barn's side entrance, clutching the crying boy, Willa was running toward them. She was barefoot in the mud, the rain plastering her dress to her skin, her face a mask of terror. She fell to her knees in front of them, her hands fluttering over her son. "Silas, oh Silas." She scooped the boy into her arms, holding him tight as he clung to her. His sobs muffled against her shoulder. Her frantic eyes then shot up to Coulter. He was deathly pale, his lips drawn tight against the pain, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. "You're hurt." He tried to shrug with his good shoulder, the movement sending a fresh wave of fire through him. "Nothing I haven't earned." She reached up her hand, trembling as she touched his cheek. Her touch was hesitant, gentle. "You didn't have to go in there." His gaze dropped to Silas, now safe in his mother's embrace, and then met hers again. The rain streamed down his face, mingling with the sweat of his exertion. "Yes," he said, his voice raw but certain. "I did." Word of what Coulter Vane had done traveled faster than the receding storm. It wasn't just gossip this time. It was a story told with a grudging respect. The preacher's wife, who had once looked at Willa with open disdain, stopped her outside the general store. "That child could have died," she whispered, her eyes filled with a new understanding. "He's not even your blood." "No," Willa replied softly. The woman nodded, a slow, thoughtful gesture. But he held him like he was. For the first time in a long while, the whispers about the strange household on the Vane ranch quieted. In their place, something else, something akin to acceptance, began to take root. The days that followed were quieter, not with the emptiness of grief, but with the hushed reverence of recovery. Coulter's shoulder was broken, the pain a dull, constant throb that kept him from his work and haunted his sleep. He moved slowly, his arm bound in a sling Willa had fashioned from a clean bed sheet. She took over the ranch's harder chores without a word of complaint. She didn't fuss over him or hover, but he felt her care in everything, in the way his tools were laid out on the workbench, easy for his one good hand to reach. In the warm towel she left folded on the porch railing each morning. In the gentle way she helped him change his bandages at night, her fingers deft and careful on his skin. One evening, as the last of the sunlight dipped behind the crimson buttes, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet, Coulter sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The silence between them had become comfortable, a shared space that no longer needed to be filled with words. But tonight it felt different. It felt ready. "My wife's name was May," he said, his voice low and rough, directed at the fire. Willa looked up from the shirt she was mending, her needle pausing mid-stitch. She said nothing, simply waited. "She had a stubborn streak," he continued, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "Used to argue with me about fence posts and feed schedules like she ran the place." He paused, his smile fading. "Which she did." Willa set her needle down, giving him her full attention. We never got to have kids. Tried for years. Lost 2 before they ever drew a breath. After the last one, she just got quiet. The light went out of her. He stared deep into the flames, as if seeing a past he could not escape. I think that's why she was so slow to move that day in the bank. When the shooting started, it was like she didn't care anymore what happened to her. Like part of her was already gone. He didn't finish. The weight of the memory was too heavy. The silence returned, but now it held the shape of his confession. After a moment, Willa rose without a word, went into the kitchen, and returned with a small pie dish still warm from the oven. The scent of cinnamon and roasted squash filled the room. "Pumpkin pie," she said softly, placing it on the small table between them. She handed him a fork. There were no words of pity, no empty condolences, just a simple, profound act of care. He looked at the pie, then at her, and a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through his chest. "She made it like this," he whispered. "Every harvest." Willa gave a small understanding nod. Later that night, long after the children were asleep and the house was dark, Coulter stepped out onto the porch. His shoulder throbbed a dull counterpoint to the ache in his heart. He looked up at the sky, a vast blanket of stars scattered like spilled salt across black velvet. Willa stepped out quietly behind him, a shawl draped over her shoulders. She stood beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her presence. "I was born in Garland County, Arkansas." She began, her voice a low murmur. "My daddy died on the railroad. My mama took in laundry scrubbing until her fingers bled through the winter water. She never complained, just got quieter every year." She paused, her hands folding in her lap. "I married Eli Hartley because he was the first boy who didn't talk down to me. I thought that made him a good man." Her voice flattened, taking on the tone of someone reciting a tired old ledger. "He was never mean. Just scared. Scared of failure, scared of silence, scared of his own children sometimes. They drafted him for the border wars. He ran. They caught him and shot him for a deserter before he made it a mile from camp." She took a shaky breath. "His family said I brought him shame. Told me to leave. I had 3 mouths to feed and nowhere to go. I took a job cooking at a saloon. The rumors started. Men thought they could treat me a certain way. The women wouldn't even look me in the eye. I saved what I could, kept my head down. Then there was a fire. Lost everything I had. Almost lost Lark." Her voice grew softer. "That's when I saw your notice. I prayed you wouldn't ask too many questions." She finally turned to look at him, her face calm in the starlight. But her eyes held a universe of weariness. He saw a mirror of his own loss in them, a different story with the same heartbreaking end. Without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a faded cream handkerchief with pale blue stitching at the edge. It was May's. He handed it to her. She blinked, confused, then her eyes widened slightly as she understood. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. She held it in both hands, not as a piece of cloth, but as something sacred. She didn't cry. She didn't have to. They stood that way for a long time, 2 solitary souls sharing a silent understanding under the vast, indifferent sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped, and a single star streaked across the heavens, a brief golden scar against the black. Neither of them made a wish. Some things they both knew were already in motion. With Coulter's arm healing, a tentative rhythm settled over the ranch. The town's attitude had thawed, and a new face in town, Sheriff Brody, began stopping by. He was a kind, observant man in his late 40s, his eyes missing nothing. He'd come to the territory to investigate a series of accidents plaguing ranchers, the same land baron a ruthless man named Thorne was suspected, but nothing could be proven. Brody took a quiet liking to Coulter and his unconventional family, often sharing coffee on the porch and talking about the weather, though his sharp gaze took in every detail of the recovering ranch. The fragile peace was shattered on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. A rider appeared on the horizon, trailing a plume of dust behind him. He rode with a casual arrogance, his posture sharp in the saddle. By the time Coulter walked up from the corral, Willa was already on the porch, her body rigid. Lark and Silas flanking her like small, silent guards. The rider dismounted slowly, his high-heeled boots hitting the dirt with a deliberate thud. He was handsome in a slick, predatory way, with a charming smile that never quite reached his cold, assessing eyes. He swept his wide-brimmed hat from his head, revealing perfectly coiffed, dark hair. "Willa, my love," he said, his voice smooth as whiskey. "Took me a while, but I finally found you." Willa's face drained of all color. "Evan," she breathed the name a wisp of sound. Coulter stepped forward, placing himself between Willa and the stranger. "You know this man." Before she could answer, the stranger tipped his head at Coulter. "The name's Evan. And this here," he said, gesturing to Willa with a possessive flick of his wrist, "is my estranged wife, Willa Hartley." The words hung in the hot, still air. Willa gasped. "That's a lie." Evan's charming smile hardened at the edges. "Is it? You ran off after Eli died, darling. But we both know my brother wasn't the one you were truly promised to. Our families had an arrangement." He turned his attention back to Coulter, his eyes narrowing. "She told you my brother was her husband, I suppose. A desperate woman tells desperate lies." But it wasn't Evan's words that made Coulter's blood run cold. It was the object hanging from a leather cord around his neck. A silver locket, tarnished and familiar. As Evan moved, the sun caught it, and Coulter saw it clearly, a lone hawk, its wings spread wide in silent flight. The memory hit him like a physical blow, a chaotic bank, the smell of gunpowder, the glint of something silver on the floorboards next to May's still body. His hand instinctively went to his own pocket, where the identical locket, the one he'd carried for 5 years as a token of his vengeance, rested cold and heavy. It couldn't be. A coincidence. "You're mistaken." Coulter said, his voice dangerously low. "She's under my protection." Evan chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "Is she now? Well, we'll see what the good people of redemption have to say about a man shacking up with another man's wife." He glanced around the ranch, his eyes lingering on the newly mended barn, the healthy livestock. A flicker of something greed, or perhaps something darker, passed over his face. He was assessing the property, Coulter realized with a jolt. He wasn't just here for Willa. Evan Hartley was a venomous artist, and the town of Redemption was his canvas. He didn't shout or make threats. He worked with whispers, with feigned concern, with sly insinuations dropped in the general store and the saloon. "I just want my Willa back," he'd say to the blacksmith, his voice heavy with false sorrow. A man comes back from the border wars to find his intended has run off with some broken-down rancher. It ain't right. To the preacher's wife, he was a wounded soul. "I worry about those children. Vane's a hard man. They say his wife's death. Well, they say it changed him. It ain't a healthy place for a family." Slowly, insidiously, he poisoned the well of goodwill that Willa and Coulter had so carefully dug. The acceptance they had earned began to curdle back into suspicion. Doors that had opened to them began to close. The sabotage started subtly. A section of fence Coulter had just repaired was cut during the night, scattering a dozen head of cattle. The well pump mysteriously jammed its gears clogged with sand. Evan was always nearby to offer a helping hand, clucking his tongue in sympathy. "Tough luck, Vane. Seems like this place is fighting you every step of the way." Coulter saw the truth. He saw the calculation in Evan's eyes, the faint smirk he wore when he thought no one was looking. And he saw the hawk locket, a constant burning reminder of the day his life fell apart. The possibility that this man was connected to May's death was a splinter in his mind, festering, impossible to ignore. He began watching Evan, his suspicion a cold, hard knot in his gut. Evan grew bolder. He began asking pointed questions around town, cloaked in casual curiosity. That bank robbery 5 years back? Terrible business. Anyone ever hear what happened to those outlaws? I heard Vane was there. Must have been awful seeing his wife go down like that. He even rode out to the small fenced-in plot on the hill where Coulter had buried May, standing by the simple wooden cross for a long time, an act of performative respect that made Coulter's skin crawl. Sheriff Brody grew suspicious, too. "Funny how trouble follows that Hartley fellow around," he remarked to Coulter one afternoon. "And funny how it always seems to land on your doorstep. He's got connections to Thorne, too. Saw them talking behind the saloon. Thorne's been trying to buy you out for years." The pressure was mounting. Coulter felt as if the walls were closing in the past and present, converging into a single looming threat. The ranch, which had begun to feel like a home again, now felt like a battleground. The storm broke on a Friday night, the sky unleashing a fury that seemed personal. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the very foundations of the ranch house, and lightning turned the windows into blinding white squares. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Evan had shown up just before the rain hit under the pretense of seeking shelter. Now he stood before the hearth, the firelight dancing on his face, twisting his charming features into something malevolent. The charming mask was gone. "You've been a fool, Coulter." Evan sneered, his hand resting casually on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. "All this time you've been looking at this," he said, pulling the hawk locket from under his shirt, "and you never once put it together." Coulter stood across the room, his body coiled and tense. Willa was frozen by the kitchen doorway, the children huddled behind her skirts. Put what together? Evan's laugh was a bitter, ugly sound. "This locket belonged to my brother, Jesse. The boy you shot in the back 2 years ago when you finally tracked him down for what happened in that bank." The world tilted on its axis. It wasn't Evan who had been there. It was his brother, the nervous boy, the one whose stray bullet had stolen May's life. Coulter had hunted him for 3 years, a relentless, vengeful wraith. He had found him, and in a final, desperate shootout, he had killed him. He had never known his name. Jesse. My brother wasn't a killer. Evan spat, his voice trembling with a rage he'd kept buried for years. He was a scared kid trying to save our family. That land baron Thorne. He was squeezing our farm just like he's squeezing you. The bank robbery was our last chance. Jesse never meant to hurt anyone. Your wife, that was an accident. But your revenge, that was a choice. You took my brother from me. So I decided I'd take everything from you." His eyes, cold and hard, shifted to Willa. Finding her was a gift. The perfect way to get close. To ruin your name, to break your spirit, to take this land and leave you with nothing but the dust, just like you left me. As he spoke, a particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the house. The oil lantern on the mantelpiece shuddered, tipped and crashed to the floor, its glass shattering. Burning oil splashed across the dry wooden floorboards and a bearskin rug, which erupted in a whoosh of orange flame. Smoke began to fill the room instantly. Evan, momentarily startled, drew his pistol. Nobody moves. He screamed over the growing roar of the fire and the storm. He grabbed Willa, pulling her in front of him as a shield. "This place is going to burn to the ground, with all of us in it. Unless you sign this deed over to me right now." He shoved a crumpled paper from his coat pocket onto the table. It was a bill of sale made out to Thorn. The children were screaming. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, licking up the walls. The barn was next. Through the window, Coulter saw a flash of lightning strike the barn's tin roof. And a moment later, a new, fiercer glow began to pulse from within. The whole ranch was going up in flames. Coulter's mind raced, cutting through the grief and the shock. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. He looked at Evan, a man twisted by a loss so similar to his own, a distorted reflection in a cracked mirror. He saw the desperation in his eyes, the same desperation that had driven his brother Jesse into that bank 5 years ago. "Let them go," Evan Coulter said, his voice calm and steady amidst the chaos. "This is between you and me. Thorn is the enemy here, not them. He used your family, and now he's using you." "Shut up," Evan shrieked, pressing the gun to Willa's temple. But the seed of doubt was planted. Coulter saw it. He needed a distraction. "The barn," he yelled, pointing out the window. "The livestock." Evan's head snapped toward the window, instinctively looking at the potential loss of his prize. It was the only opening Coulter would get. He lunged forward, not at Evan, but at the heavy oak table. With a surge of adrenaline, he shoved it with all his might. The table slid across the floor, slamming into Evan's legs and knocking him off balance. Willa twisted free, scrambling toward the children. "Get outside." Now she screamed. Coulter tackled Evan, the two men crashing to the floor amidst the spreading flames. They rolled fists, flying a desperate, brutal struggle for survival. Smoke choked the air, burning their lungs. Outside, the storm raged, and the fire roared, devouring the life Coulter had just begun to rebuild. He wasn't just fighting for a ranch anymore. He was fighting for a future. He was fighting for his family. The storm broke with the dawn, its fury spent. A pale, watery light filtered through the smoke-filled sky, illuminating a scene of devastation. The barn was a blackened, skeletal ruin, still smoldering. A large section of the ranch house roof had collapsed, and the walls were charred and scorched. But it was still standing. Sheriff Brody and a posse of men from town arrived to find Coulter soot-stained and exhausted, sitting on the porch steps. Willa was tending to a burn on his arm, while the children sat huddled together under a blanket, shaken but safe. Evan Hartley was tied securely to a porch post, his face bruised, his spirit broken. A final quiet moment of understanding had passed between him and Coulter. In the ashes of their shared conflict, two men broken by the same cycle of violence and loss. The townspeople did not stand by and watch. They saw the ruin, but they also saw the family that had survived it. They saw Coulter's fierce protection and Willa's unwavering strength. Without a word being spoken, a new purpose took hold. The blacksmith arrived with a wagon full of tools. The preacher's wife came with baskets of food and blankets. Men began assessing the damage to the house, their voices low and practical, planning the repairs. They rallied not out of pity, but out of a shared sense of community, of belonging. In the days that followed, the sound of hammers replaced the silence, and the ranch, which had been a place of solitary grief, became a hub of collective renewal. A few weeks later, when the new roof was on and the scent of fresh-cut pine had replaced the smell of smoke, Coulter walked with Willa up the small hill behind the house. The grass was green again after the rains. They stopped before the simple wooden cross that marked May's grave. The setting sun cast long shadows across the valley. For a long time, Coulter stood in silence, his hat in his hands. Then he knelt. From his pocket, he carefully withdrew the faded cream handkerchief, with the pale blue stitching. He gently placed it on the weathered headstone, a final tender goodbye to the all-consuming grief that had defined him for so long. He wasn't erasing May's memory. He was honoring it by choosing to live again. He stood and turned to Willa. Her eyes were soft, filled with a deep, quiet understanding. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. It was the official deed to the ranch, newly registered by Sheriff Brody. He handed it to her. She unfolded it, her brow furrowed in confusion. Then her breath caught. At the top of the page, 2 names were listed as owners: Coulter Vane and Willa Hartley. It wasn't a proposal of marriage. It was something more profound. It was an offering of partnership, a testament to a home built not on a shared past, but on a chosen future. Coulter, she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He simply met her gaze, his own eyes clear for the first time in years. A smile, slow and genuine, finally reached them. From the bottom of the hill, they heard the sound of children's laughter. Lark, Silas, and Boone were chasing a stray jackrabbit near the newly built corral, their small figures silhouetted against the golden light. Willa folded the deed and reached out, taking his hand. Their fingers interlaced, a warm, familiar pressure. Together, they stood on the hill, watching the children play, 2 solitary souls who had found their way home, not to a place, but to each other. They rode out the next morning, the 5 of them, to survey the boundaries of their land. A new family forged in fire and loyalty, riding together into a future as wide and hopeful as the New Mexico sky.